What happens when Hollywood's toughest guy shows up for what should be a routine morning show interview, only to find out the host has a hidden agenda far beyond promoting his new movie? You're about to find out, and trust me, this confrontation escalated to the point where security had to step in. But before we get into this explosive moment, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really happened behind the scenes. The morning began like any other at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. Sylvester Stallone arrived early, dressed in his signature black leather jacket, looking every bit the action hero, even at 77. His publicist had told him to expect a light conversation, a little about his new film, maybe some nostalgia about Rocky and Rambo, just the usual promotional routine. What no one saw coming was that George Stephanopoulos had spent the night digging into old interviews and controversial remarks, clearly preparing to trade his morning show host role for something more like a hard-hitting journalist. As the cameras started rolling and the Good Morning America theme faded out, George flashed a polished television smile, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. "We're here with legendary actor Sylvester Stallone," he began, his voice carrying the familiar tone from his political broadcasting days. "Sly, thanks for joining us this morning." Stallone leaned back in the chair, that familiar slur in his voice as he answered, "Thanks for having me, George. Always good to be here." But there was something in George's tone that should have served as a warning. Instead of the usual small talk about family or upcoming projects, he leaned in slightly, his face shifting into what he likely thought was a serious journalistic stance. "Before we get into your new film, I want to touch on something that's been on a lot of viewers' minds," he said. "You've made some strong political statements over the years. Frankly, some people are questioning whether Hollywood stars should be using their platforms to shape political conversations." The question hung in the air like a provocation. Stallone's face didn't shift right away, but anyone who knew him would have noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes, the slight clench in his jaw. This wasn't what they had discussed during the pre-interview. "Well, George," Stallone said, his tone calm but edged with tension. "Last I checked, this was still America, and Americans have the right to express their views. That includes actors, journalists, even former political operatives turned morning show hosts." The jab at George's political past was subtle, but unmistakable. George's smile faltered for just a second, but he pressed on, committed to whatever script he had in mind. "But don't you think fame comes with responsibility?" he asked. "When you speak, millions listen. Shouldn't you be more cautious about what message you're sending?" Stallone shifted in his seat, the irritation now clear in his voice. "Cautious about what? Exactly. Speaking my mind. Loving my country. I've been doing this for 50 years, George, and I've never pretended to be anything I'm not. If that's a problem for some people, that's their issue, not mine." Tension filled the studio. Camera operators exchanged glances. In the control room, producers were beginning to squirm. This was supposed to be a fluff interview, not a political standoff. But George seemed fueled by the friction. Maybe he thought he was channeling his old political instincts, or maybe he truly believed this was real journalism. Either way, he pushed forward. "I'm just saying, with great power comes great responsibility. Your platform carries a lot of weight." Stallone raised an eyebrow. "Did you just quote Spider-Man at me?" For a moment, there was genuine disbelief in his voice. "George, I came here to talk about my movie. Maybe share a few stories to entertain your audience. I didn't come here to be lectured by someone who spent years crafting narratives for politicians, telling me how I should use my voice." The reference to George's past as a political strategist and former White House communications director clearly struck a nerve. His professional composure slipped, his tone sharpened. "I think that's a little unfair, Sly. My background gives me insight into how messaging works. I'm just saying, maybe, just maybe, You should consider your words more carefully. Think before I speak, Stallone echoed, his voice rising. The temper he usually kept buried in public was beginning to surface. Let me tell you something about thinking before speaking, George. I've been thinking about what I want to say for 70 years. I've earned the right to speak my mind. Through hard work. By creating characters that inspired people. By entertaining millions. So what gives you the right to tell me to watch what I say? The studio audience, expecting a cheerful interview, was now watching something entirely different unfold. Some looked uneasy. Others were glued to the moment. In the control room, producers scrambled, debating whether to cut to commercial or let it continue. George, sensing he may have gone too far, but unable to retreat without losing face, pivoted. Look, I'm not trying to attack you personally. I'm asking questions I think our viewers want answered. There's been criticism about some of your recent comments, and I think people deserve a response. What criticism? Stallone shot back. From who? Twitter. Bloggers who've never created anything. Political pundits who flip their takes based on the latest polling. You want to talk about thinking before speaking? Maybe you should have thought about what this interview was supposed to be before turning it into a political ambush. The word ambush hung in the air. In that moment, everyone in the studio recognized this had gone well beyond the boundaries of a standard interview. It was personal now, and Stallone wasn't backing down. George's face reddened, his polished-on-air persona beginning to crack. It's not an ambush to ask real questions about public statements, he said. That's called journalism. Something you might not understand, given your background in, well, punching people on screen. He said it with a practiced smile, but the jab was clear. The implication, that Stallone was little more than a brute, a shallow actor who just pretended to fight, was the kind of Hollywood elitism that had always rubbed Stallone, a Philly-born underdog, the wrong way. Stallone didn't miss a beat. Punching people on screen, huh? Well, at least when I throw a punch, the audience knows it's fiction. When you were spinning stories in Washington, people actually thought it was the truth. So tell me. George, who was really fooling people. Silence fell over the studio. Only the quiet hum of the cameras remained. George opened his mouth, as if to reply, but nothing came out. In that stillness, both men seemed to recognize a line had been crossed. One that couldn't be undone. The silence stretched on, just 3 or 4 seconds by the clock, but an eternity in television time. George's face had drained of color. His hair, still in place, somehow looked slightly disturbed. Stallone's comment had landed exactly where it was aimed, at George's credibility and pride. When George finally spoke again, his voice had changed. The warmth was gone. The easy charm replaced by something colder, more mechanical. I think you're being incredibly unfair, and frankly, disrespectful to our audience. People tune into Good Morning America because they trust us to ask tough questions, George said, not to toss softballs that double as ads for your movies. Stallone leaned back, but it wasn't casual. It was measured, like a fighter between rounds, eyeing his opponent, deciding his next move. Tough questions, he said. George, you want to talk about tough questions? Here's one for you. Back when you were in the White House, spinning stories and manipulating media, did it ever occur to you that that platform came with responsibility? Or were you too busy shaping public perception to worry about telling people the truth? The blow landed hard. George had worked for years to rebuild his image, as a journalist, not a political operative. Having that reinvention publicly questioned, and on live television no less, clearly rattled him. That's not the same thing, he stammered, his composure cracking. My job in the White House was to communicate policy. What I do now, that's journalism. I ask tough questions no matter who's in the chair. Oh, really? Stallone's voice was thick with disbelief. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you brought me here under false pretenses. just to blindside me with political gotchas. Is that what passes for journalism now? Or is this your way of staying relevant, clinging to whatever's left of your political past? That hit deep. George's need for relevance was no secret. In the control room, the executive producer was on his feet, gesturing wildly and barking orders through his headset. Crew members had stopped moving. Everyone was watching. This wasn't just an uncomfortable segment anymore. This was becoming a moment in broadcast history. George responded, jaw tight. I don't have anything to prove. Especially not to someone whose biggest contribution to American culture is a string of movies about punching people. That line landed with a thud. He'd just insulted not only Stallone's work, but the decades of meaning it carried for millions. Even members of the crew winced. George hadn't just criticized Stallone. He'd dismissed everything he represented. Stallone's reply came low, quiet, barely more than a whisper, but sharper than any shout. Movies about punching people, he said. Is that really what you think Rocky was? A movie about fighting? He leaned in slightly, eyes locked on George. Rocky was about a guy from Philly who got one shot. Who went the distance when no one believed he could? It was about dignity, about hope, about not giving up when the world tells you you're nothing. Millions of people found something real in that. Something that mattered. He paused. What has your career inspired people to do, George? Lee better. Twist the truth more convincingly. George knew in that instant he'd overplayed his hand. But instead of stepping back, he lunged forward with the reckless edge of someone realizing they're losing. Don't talk to me about inspiration, he said. At least my work dealt with real problems, real people, not fantasy, not pretend battles in a movie theater. Fantasy. Stallone's voice rose, and now the anger was real. You think what Rocky went through was fantasy. You think veterans, guys who came back from Vietnam and saw themselves in Rambo, were watching make-believe? His eyes burned. You don't understand a damn thing. These characters meant something to people, Stallone said. Because they represented something real, something true about the human spirit. Then he turned the question around. What was real about the stories you told in Washington, George? What was true about the spin you put on policies that shaped millions of lives? The studio was now completely silent. Some in the audience glanced nervously between the two men like spectators at a tennis match. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several had their phones out, already recording what they instinctively knew was turning into something unforgettable. George's media training kicked in. He tried to steer things back on course. Look, we're getting off track here. I'm not attacking your films. I'm trying to have a real conversation about the responsibility that comes with fame. You're the one making this personal. Stallone laughed, but it was cold, stripped of all humor. I'm making it personal. George, you opened this by questioning my right to speak. Then you called my work nothing more than punching people on screen. And now you want to lecture me on who made it personal. He leaned forward slightly. You made it personal the second. You used this interview to grind your political axe instead of doing what you told my team you would. That line hit hard. George knew the rules of broadcast. Ambushing a guest broke the trust that held interviews together. His reply was defensive, and it showed. Sometimes in journalism, you have to follow the story where it leads, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Stallone repeated it back, stunned. Follow the story where it leads. What story, George? He didn't wait for an answer. The story of a 77-year-old actor who dares to have an opinion. A guy who came from nothing and thinks he's earned the right to speak his mind. Or is it really the story of a former political operative trying to prove he's a journalist? By cornering someone who can't fight back because they're stuck in your studio. That phrase, stuck in your studio, seemed to change everything. Both men felt it. Stallone looked around, at the cameras, the lights, the silent crew, the watching crowd, his jaw set harder, George followed his gaze. And for the first time, he seemed to register how this looked from the outside, how it would look to millions watching at home. "No one's trapped," George said, but even he didn't sound convinced. "This is a conversation between two adults about serious issues." "That's all this is? A conversation?" Stallone stood. The motion was sudden, forceful, enough that a few crew members stepped back instinctively. "George, this stopped being a conversation 20 minutes ago. This turned into an interrogation. And let me make something clear. I didn't show up to be interrogated by someone who thinks their political somme gives them the right to question my patriotism or my right to speak freely." Now standing, Stallone's presence was commanding. At 77, he still had the build, the posture, the weight of a man who'd trained his body and carried himself like a fighter. He seemed to tower over the set. George, still sitting, looked noticeably smaller by comparison. "Sit down. Sly," he said, trying to regain some control. "We're not done." But before the words had fully left his mouth, Stallone responded with a calm, unwavering tone, one that told everyone in the room this was the end. "Yeah, George, we are." That final line hung in the air like a hammer. Unmovable. Final. George, seated and staring up at Stallone, made one last and fatal mistake. Instead of accepting the clear signal that the conversation was over, instead of pulling back and salvaging what little remained of the interview, he made the choice to push one more time. "You don't get to decide when we're finished," George snapped, his voice rising with a kind of artificial authority that betrayed just how out of control things had become. He seemed to forget who he was talking to, a man who'd spent a lifetime defying expectations and refusing to back down, whether in the ring, on screen, or in life. "My studio. You agreed to be here? So sit down, and let's finish this like adults." The words had barely landed when a shift rippled through the room. Everyone, crew, audience, even the sound tech in the back, recognized instantly that George had crossed a line. Stallone didn't shout. He didn't need to. His expression went from heated to glacial, the kind of calm that came before a storm, the kind that had made entire theaters fall silent in anticipation. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but sharp as steel. "Your show, your studio," he said, stepping forward, not in a threatening way, but with the full presence of someone who'd been commanding rooms longer than George had been out of college. "Let me tell you something about your show, George. I've been making movies since before you even knew how to look into a camera, without a teleprompter telling you what to say. I've spent decades giving people stories they could believe in, hope they could hold on to. While you were busy in DC, learning how to sell lies with a smile." He took another step. The studio felt smaller. "And now you think you get to tell me when I can talk, when I can leave. You think this studio, these lights, this chair gives you power over me." George's face was pale, but pride, or panic, pushed him to speak. "Basic courtesy," he said stiffly, "means finishing an interview. Even when the questions are tough. Tell questions," Stallone repeated, scoffing. "You want to talk about tough? All right. Here's one. How many times did you lie for a paycheck in Washington? How many times did you twist the truth because it suited your party or your boss? And when you put on this journalism costume, did you actually learn how to be honest? Or did you just get better at disguising your spin?" The words landed like punches. George's carefully managed persona cracked. His mask slipped. What came through next wasn't polished professionalism. It was raw, bitter ego. "How dare you question my integrity?" he spat. "I've been a journalist longer than you've been grunting on camera. My work requires intelligence, not just veins and slow-motion punches." There was an audible gasp from someone in the crew. In the control room, the executive producer was shouting to cut to commercial, but the camera operator didn't move, didn't blink. He knew this wasn't a breakdown. This was a reckoning. Stallone didn't miss a beat. "Intelligence," he said slowly. "Let me break this down in words, Even a washed-up spin doctor can understand. You invited me here under false pretenses. You ambushed me with politics, insulted my work, questioned my right to speak about my own country, and now you're trying to trap me in your studio while you puff your chest for the cameras. And that's what you think intelligence looks like. He glanced around the studio, crew members frozen, audience captivated, cameras still rolling. You know what real intelligence would have been, George. Doing the interview you promised. Treating your guest with an ounce of respect. Remembering that people turn on morning TV to feel something. Not to watch a bitter ex-operative try to play journalist by picking fights with actors who dared to outgrow their scripts. That last line, bitter ex-operative, hit George like a body blow. His face twisted not with guilt, but with rage. His voice trembled when he spoke. Washed up, he hissed. I've forgotten more about politics and journalism than you'll ever learn about anything. Other than flexing your biceps and pretending to be brave in front of a green screen. You're nothing but a muscle. Headed, has been who peaked 40 years ago in a movie about a loser boxer. The moment the words left his mouth, George seemed to grasp instantly that he had gone too far. But it was already too late. Calling Rocky, a film about a loser boxer, wasn't just a dig at Stallone. It was an insult to something millions around the world held sacred. Rocky Balboa wasn't just a character. He was an emblem of resilience, of hope. Stallone's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried to every inch of the studio. A loser boxer, he repeated. You just called Rocky Balboa a loser boxer. He shook his head slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd just heard. George, that movie wasn't about boxing. It was about a guy who got one shot to show he mattered, who wouldn't quit, no matter how many people told him to. It was about dignity, self-respect, going the distance even when the world says you're done. And you just called him a loser. The entire studio went still, only the faint hum of equipment breaking the silence. Everyone there knew something real had just happened. The veneer of staged media and polished dialogue had cracked, and what was left was raw, unscripted humanity. You know what, George? Stallone continued, his voice still quiet, now tinged with finality. You're right about one thing. This is your show. Your studio. But I don't have to sit here and listen to someone who's never created anything meaningful insult the kind of work that's inspired millions. I don't have to be lectured about integrity by a man who built his career spinning narratives. He began unclipping the mic from his jacket. The motion, though simple, was layered with more weight than any scene he'd ever performed. You want to finish this interview so badly, he said. Then go ahead. Finish it by yourself. Tell the cameras how tough your questions were. How you put that muscle, bound has been in his place. I'm sure your viewers will be riveted. George, recognizing just how badly this had spiraled, made one last desperate attempt at control. You can't just walk out. We have a contract. We have obligations. Stallone paused, halfway through removing the mic. His eyes locked on George with unfiltered contempt. A contract, he said. You want to talk about contracts. He finished removing the mic and let it drop onto the small table between them. The thud, though soft, echoed with finality. The contract was for a promotional interview. What you gave me was a political ambush, an attempt to humiliate me in front of a national audience. You broke that contract the moment you turned this into a personal attack against anyone who doesn't think the way you do. He stood. A's for commitments. Mine was to be professional, respectful, entertaining. What was yours, George? Because only one of us upheld it. A Stallone turned toward the edge of the set. That's when George made his final mistake. He stood abruptly and grabbed Stallone's arm, trying to stop him. You're not going anywhere until we finish this, George said, his voice a strange mix of desperation and authority. The contact was like flipping a switch. Stallone turned, his expression steel. He looked at George's hand on his arm, then up at his face. Take your hand off me, he said, each word calm and deliberate. George didn't let go. We're going to finish this interview like professionals. What followed happened in a flash. Stallone didn't hit him, didn't lash out. He simply shrugged his arm free with the fluid strength of someone who had spent a lifetime in peak physical form. The motion sent George stumbling backward into his chair. "Security," Stallone said, his voice loud, clear, and unshaken. "I need an escort. This interview is over." This man just tried to stop me from leaving, physically. With the word security, snapped the room out of its trance. Suddenly, everyone was in motion. Guards emerged from the wings. The executive producer rushed out from the control booth. Crew members stepped in, unsure of what, exactly, they were supposed to do. George sat frozen in his chair, blinking dazed, trying to piece together how things had collapsed so completely. "This is ridiculous," he said, voice cracking. "He can't just walk out in the middle of an interview." A large, composed security guard stepped toward Stallone with professional calm. "Mr. Stallone, is there a problem here?" "The problem," Stallone said, voice calm and steady, "is that I was invited here for a promotional interview, and instead, I walked into a political ambush. The host apparently believes his background in government entitles him to interrogate guests and physically restrain them when they try to leave." The security guard glanced at George, then over to the executive producer, who had just reached the interview set. A woman in her 50s with the unmistakable demeanor of someone who'd seen her share of studio disasters. She whispered something to the guard before turning to Stallone. "Mr. Stallone," she said gently, "I sincerely apologize. If you'd prefer to leave, we'll make that happen immediately." "That is exactly what I prefer," Stallone answered. "And your viewers should know. This is what journalism looks like now on Good Morning America. Ambush questions and physical intimidation when a guest doesn't follow the host's script." As the security team began escorting him toward the exit, George called out from behind him, voice sharp and desperate. "This is what I meant. You can't handle tough questions. So you storm out like a cow," or Stallone stopped. Slowly, he turned. The look he gave George wasn't angry. It was colder than that. It was disappointment laced with contempt. "Hey, coward George, you want to know what takes courage," he said. "It takes courage to create something that gives people hope. To build a character who stands for something when the world tells him he's nothing. To keep going when no one believes in you. That's courage. And you know what doesn't take courage?" Stallone continued, locking eyes with George. "Sitting behind a desk and throwing cheap shots at guests who can't hit back. Hiding behind the safety of a studio and calling someone a coward when you know they're walking away from the mess you made." Then he turned toward the main camera, addressing not the host but the millions watching. "You want to talk about cowardice? It's calling someone a coward after you've provoked a fight and couldn't finish it." With that, he walked off. Security flanked him as he exited the set. George remained seated, motionless. The cameras kept rolling. For a few long seconds, there was only silence. Then the executive producer's voice cut in sharply. "Go to commercial. Now, but not before America saw George Stephanopoulos sitting alone, staring into the lens, looking smaller than he ever had. The weight of the moment settling visibly on his shoulders. That's how Sylvester Stallone left one of the biggest morning shows in the country. Not because he couldn't face tough questions, but because he wouldn't tolerate disrespect masquerading as journalism. So what do you think? Was George doing his job, or did he go too far? Let us know in the comments.